Some people walk into a church to be seen, others walk in just to survive the week. The crying came first, sharp and fragile, slicing through the quiet like a crack in glass, and every head turned at once, not with compassion but with that familiar, silent judgment that Hannah Brooks had learned to recognize without even looking up. She shifted her baby slightly against her shoulder, her fingers trembling just enough to betray how little sleep she'd had, the soft fabric of her worn sweater brushing against the child's cheek as she whispered something only a mother would understand, her voice low, apologetic, almost invisible, but the whispers around her were not. They moved like a current, subtle but cutting, carried through polished shoes and pressed suits and the faint scent of expensive perfume that seemed to fill the entire chapel. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting fractured colors across the wooden pews, blues and reds and golds dancing across faces that didn't soften when they reached hers, instead highlighting the contrast, the faded denim of her jeans, the scuffed edges of her sneakers, the diaper bag at her feet that had seen better days, everything about her quietly announcing that she didn't belong here, at least not by their standards. She lowered her eyes, not in shame but in exhaustion, adjusting the baby's blanket, careful, deliberate. Like every movement mattered, like every second she kept her composure was a small victory no one else would ever notice. The pastor hadn't begun yet, the room still held that pre-service hush, but it wasn't peaceful for her, it was heavy, filled with the weight of 100 unspoken opinions pressing in from every direction. A woman in front of her leaned slightly to the side, just enough to glance back, her expression polite on the surface but edged with something colder underneath, and Hannah had seen that look before. In grocery store lines, in waiting rooms, in places where people decided who you were before you ever spoke a word. The baby whimpered again, softer this time, and Hannah instinctively pressed a gentle kiss to the child's forehead, her lips lingering for just a second longer than necessary, as if that small gesture could shield them both from everything else in the room. She hadn't planned to come today, not really, but when the power bill notice came folded under her door that morning and the balance in her checking account read less than $12, she needed somewhere quiet, somewhere steady. Somewhere that reminded her she wasn't completely alone, even if no one here knew her name. She shifted again, careful not to disturb anyone, careful not to draw more attention, but attention had already found her, it always did, like a spotlight she never asked for. Somewhere near the entrance, heels clicked against the marble floor, slow and deliberate, the kind of sound that carried authority without a single word being spoken, and a subtle change moved through the room. Conversations paused. Posture straightened, as if someone important had just arrived, someone who belonged in a way Hannah never could, and though she didn't turn to look, she felt it, that shift in energy. That invisible line being drawn more clearly than ever between people like her and people who had never once worried about whether they could afford baby formula before the week was over. The heels did not stop at the back of the chapel, they continued forward, measured and unhurried, each step echoing softly against the marble like a quiet announcement of status, and as the woman came into view, heads turned not out of curiosity but recognition, the kind reserved for someone whose name carried weight far beyond the walls of a church. Charlotte Whitmore moved with effortless precision, her tailored white coat falling perfectly along her frame, a subtle shimmer from the diamonds at her ears catching the stained light as if it belonged to her, as if even the sun adjusted itself around her presence, and though her expression was composed, there was a certain detachment in her eyes, a distance that suggested she observed the room rather than belonged to it. She paused briefly at the end of the aisle, offering a small nod to a couple seated near the front, their smiles quick and eager, before her gaze shifted, almost instinctively, scanning the room until it landed on something that did not fit, something that disrupted the symmetry she seemed to expect. Hannah felt it before she saw it, that subtle tightening in the air, the way conversations quieted not out of reverence but anticipation, and when she finally lifted her eyes, just slightly, their gazes met for the briefest moment, long enough for Charlotte to take in every detail, the worn fabric, the tired posture, the baby resting against her shoulder, and something in that look was not confusion, it was judgment, immediate and unfiltered. Charlotte tilted her head just a fraction, as if reassessing the space itself, and then she stepped closer, not directly yet, but enough that her presence pressed forward like a tide. Hannah instinctively shifted her baby again, her hand smoothing the blanket though it did not need smoothing, her movements small, contained, as if minimizing herself could make her invisible. But invisibility was a privilege she did not have. A man seated beside Charlotte leaned in slightly, whispering something that made her lips curve into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. And though the words were lost in the distance, the tone carried, light, dismissive, and it was enough to draw another glance in Hannah's direction, this time less subtle, more deliberate. The baby stirred again, letting out a soft, restless sound, and Hannah whispered gently, her voice barely audible, a quiet reassurance that seemed to exist only between her and the child, but Charlotte heard it. Or perhaps simply noticed the interruption, because she took another step forward, closing the distance just enough that her presence could no longer be ignored. The scent of her perfume reached Hannah then, something clean and expensive, a sharp contrast to the faint smell of baby powder and long hours that clung to her own clothes, and for a moment, the space between them felt impossibly narrow, like two entirely different worlds forced into the same frame. Charlotte's eyes moved once more over Hannah, slower this time, more deliberate, and then down to the baby, lingering there just a second longer than necessary before returning to Hannah's face, and when she finally spoke, her voice was not loud, but it carried, smooth and controlled, the kind of tone that did not need volume to command attention. "Excuse me," she said, with a softness that did not quite reach her eyes, "are you sure you are in the right place?" And though the words were simple, almost polite, the implication beneath them settled into the room like a quiet ripple, one that everyone felt but no one interrupted, leaving Hannah standing there, her breath caught somewhere between response and silence, holding her child just a little closer as the weight of being seen, truly seen, pressed heavier than ever before. Hannah did not answer right away, not because she did not understand the question, but because she understood it too well. The way it was wrapped in politeness but carried something heavier underneath, something that had nothing to do with directions or seats and everything to do with belonging. She shifted her weight slightly, her sneakers brushing softly against the polished wood floor, the faint squeak louder in her ears than it should have been, and she tightened her hold on her baby just enough to feel the steady rhythm of the child's breathing against her chest, grounding herself in something real, something that did not judge or measure her worth in quiet glances. "I am," she replied finally, her voice calm but soft, the kind of calm that came from choosing peace even when it would have been easier to shrink, and for a moment there was a pause, a brief stillness where it seemed like the room itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Charlotte's expression did not change much, but there was a subtle narrowing in her eyes, as if Hannah's answer had not aligned with the expectation she had already formed, and she glanced briefly toward the pews ahead, then back again, as though recalculating where this woman should be placed within her version of order. "This section is usually reserved," Charlotte said, her tone still smooth, still controlled, but now with a sharper edge, one that did not need to rise in volume to cut deeper, and though she did not specify reserved for whom, the implication hung clearly in the air, filling the silence that followed. A few people nearby shifted in their seats, some avoiding eye contact entirely, others pretending to be focused on their programs, the thin paper pages suddenly very important, and Hannah noticed it all without turning her head, the way people distanced themselves without moving, the quiet agreement that this moment was not theirs to interrupt. The baby stirred again, letting out a soft sigh this time, and Hannah instinctively adjusted the small knitted hat on the child's head, smoothing it gently with her thumb, a simple gesture that spoke louder than anything she could have said, because it showed what mattered to her. What always came first, no matter where she stood or who stood in front of her. "I can move if someone needs the seat," Hannah added after a moment, her words careful, not defensive, just practical, as if she had learned long ago that offering a solution often cost less than standing her ground. Even when she had every right to stay, Charlotte's lips curved slightly again, but this time the smile did not reach her eyes at all. It lingered at the edges, polished and distant, and she took a small step closer. Close enough that her presence felt intentional, deliberate, like a line being drawn more clearly. "It is not about the seat," she said, her voice lowering just enough that it felt more personal, more pointed, and for the first time, a few heads turned more openly, curiosity outweighing restraint, the moment stretching into something that could no longer be ignored. Hannah felt the weight of it settle around her, heavier now, thicker, like the air itself had changed, and for a brief second, she considered leaving, just standing up quietly and walking out before it became something bigger, something harder to carry. But then the baby's small hand curled against her sweater, gripping the fabric with surprising strength, and that tiny touch held her in place more firmly than anything else could have. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself, her gaze lifting just enough to meet Charlotte's again, not with defiance, but with something quieter, something steadier, and in that silent exchange, there was a shift, almost imperceptible, as if the story unfolding in that chapel had just taken its first real step forward, whether anyone realized it yet or not. The space between them held for a moment longer, stretched thin by expectation, until Charlotte let out a soft breath that sounded almost like patience wearing out, and she glanced briefly over her shoulder, as if checking whether anyone else was noticing, whether the room was aligned with her quiet authority, and in many ways, it was, because no one stepped in, no one spoke, the silence itself becoming a kind of agreement that this was hers to handle. "It is about respect," she said then, her voice still even but carrying more clearly now, no longer softened for just the two of them, and that subtle shift drew more attention than anything else had so far, pulling a few more eyes in their direction, some curious, some uncomfortable, but all watching. Hannah felt it settle over her shoulders like an invisible weight, heavier than before. And she swallowed slowly, her throat dry despite the cool air of the chapel, her mind moving through 100 responses she could give and discarding each one just as quickly, not because she did not have words, but because she knew how easily words could be turned against her in a room like this. She adjusted the baby again, her hand moving gently along the small back, a steady rhythm, one that calmed both of them, and when she spoke, her voice remained quiet, measured. "I did not mean any disrespect," she said, and there was no apology in her tone, only truth, simple and unadorned. Charlotte studied her for a second longer, as if searching for something that was not there, some sign of embarrassment or retreat that would make this easier to conclude, but Hannah did not offer it. She only stood there, tired but steady, holding on to the one thing that mattered more than anything else in that moment. A faint murmur moved through the pews nearby, not loud enough to be called conversation, but enough to signal that the moment had shifted again, that it was no longer invisible, and Charlotte seemed to register that too, because her posture straightened slightly, her shoulders aligning as if she had just decided something. "Then perhaps you should consider where you are sitting," she said, her gaze flicking briefly toward the front rows, where the seats remained mostly filled with people dressed in the same quiet uniform of polished appearances, before returning to Hannah, and though she still had not raised her voice, the meaning was unmistakable now, clearer than before, sharper. Hannah followed that glance for just a fraction of a second, seeing what Charlotte wanted her to see, the contrast, the separation, the invisible lines drawn long before she had walked through those doors, and for a brief moment, something flickered in her eyes, not anger, not quite, but something deeper, something that came from knowing this was not the first time she had been asked to step aside, to move, to make space for someone else's idea of order. The baby let out a soft sound again, a small, restless movement that broke the tension just enough for Hannah to focus back on what mattered, and she exhaled quietly, her shoulders lowering just a fraction, as if releasing something she had been holding too tightly. "I understand," she said after a moment, her voice still calm, still composed, and for a second, it almost sounded like she was about to move, about to gather her things and step away. And a subtle shift passed through the nearby seats, a quiet anticipation of resolution, of things returning to how they were supposed to be, but Hannah did not move, not yet, because something in her, something small but unyielding, held her in place, and in that stillness, something else changed too, something barely noticeable, like the air before a storm, because from the front of the chapel, near the pulpit, a figure had been watching the entire exchange, silent until now, his gaze steady, thoughtful, and as the final echo of Hannah's words settled into the room, Pastor Daniel Collins took a single step forward, his presence quiet but unmistakable, as if the moment everyone thought belonged to someone else was about to belong to him instead. Pastor Daniel Collins did not raise his voice when he stepped forward, but something about the way he moved shifted the entire room, quieting the low murmurs without effort, his presence carrying a calm authority that did not demand attention yet somehow held it all the same, and as he reached the edge of the pulpit, his gaze moved across the congregation slowly, deliberately, as if taking in not just the people but the moment itself, every glance, every silence, every unspoken judgment that had settled into the air. Charlotte noticed him immediately, of course she did, her posture adjusting almost imperceptibly, her shoulders easing back into something more composed, more polished, as if the presence of the pastor required a different version of herself, one that fit more neatly into the expectations of the room. Hannah felt it too. Though in a different way, not as a shift in status but as a pause, a breath she had not realized she was holding finally released, her fingers still resting gently against her baby's back, moving in that same quiet rhythm that had carried her through every difficult moment before this one. "Good morning," Pastor Daniel said, his voice warm, steady, filling the chapel without ever rising, and the simple greeting seemed to settle something, drawing the room back into a shared space rather than the divided tension that had taken hold moments earlier. A few people responded softly, their voices blending together, but the energy remained different now, more attentive, more aware, as if everyone sensed that what had just happened had not gone unnoticed. Pastor Daniel's eyes lingered briefly on Charlotte, then moved to Hannah. And there was no judgment in his expression, only recognition, the kind that came from seeing more than what was on the surface, and for a brief moment, it felt as though the entire room held its breath, waiting for him to speak again. Charlotte shifted slightly, her hand brushing lightly against the back of the pew in front of her, a small, controlled movement, but one that revealed just enough tension to suggest that she was no longer entirely comfortable, and she glanced around quickly, as if measuring the room again, recalibrating her place within it. Hannah remained still, her gaze lowered once more, not out of submission but out of habit, the quiet instinct to avoid drawing more attention than necessary, though attention had already found her in ways she could not undo. The baby stirred softly. A small movement that broke through the silence just enough to remind her of the world beyond the room, beyond the expectations and the stares, and she leaned her cheek gently against the child's head, grounding herself again in something simple and true. Pastor Daniel folded his hands loosely in front of him, his posture relaxed, unhurried, and when he spoke again, his words came with a quiet clarity that seemed to reach every corner of the chapel. "Before we begin today," he said, pausing just long enough to let the moment settle, "I would like to acknowledge something important," and though his tone remained gentle, there was a subtle weight beneath it now, something that suggested this was not part of the usual rhythm, not something planned or expected. A few heads turned more fully now, curiosity no longer hidden. And Charlotte's expression tightened just slightly, her composure still intact but no longer effortless, as if she could feel the direction of the moment shifting away from her control. Hannah lifted her eyes just a fraction, her breath catching again, not from fear this time but from uncertainty, from the sense that something was about to unfold in a way she could not predict. And as the sunlight shifted through the stained glass above, casting new patterns across the floor, Pastor Daniel took one more step forward, his gaze steady, his voice calm, as if he were about to reveal something that had been waiting patiently beneath the surface all along. The room did not move, but something inside it shifted, subtle and undeniable, like a current changing direction beneath still water, and Pastor Daniel let the silence stretch just a moment longer before he continued, his eyes moving once more across the congregation, not searching, not judging, simply seeing, and when his gaze returned to the center aisle, it lingered there with quiet intention. "There are moments," he said, his voice steady and warm, "when what we choose to notice says more about us than what we choose to ignore," and the words settled gently, yet firmly, into the space, drawing a different kind of attention now, one that turned inward rather than outward. Charlotte's posture remained composed, but her fingers tightened slightly against the polished wood of the pew. A small detail that would have gone unnoticed in any other moment, but here, in the stillness, it felt amplified, as if even the smallest movement carried weight. Hannah stood where she was, her breath slow and controlled, her baby now resting more peacefully against her shoulder, the soft rise and fall of the child's chest a quiet anchor in the midst of everything else, and though she did not fully lift her head, there was a subtle change in her stance, a steadiness that had not been there before, as if she were no longer bracing for impact but simply standing. Pastor Daniel took another step forward, his shoes making almost no sound against the floor, and when he spoke again, his tone carried something deeper now, not heavier, but more deliberate. "We come here each week to be reminded of grace," he continued, "of kindness, of the simple truth that every person who walks through these doors carries something unseen." And as he spoke, a few people shifted in their seats, the weight of his words finding places they had not expected. Charlotte's gaze flickered briefly, just for a second, toward Hannah, and then away again, as if the connection had become something she could not fully control, something that no longer fit neatly within her understanding of the moment. A faint rustle moved through the room, not distraction, but awareness, as if everyone present could feel the shift but could not yet name it. Pastor Daniel paused again, his hands still loosely folded, his expression calm, and then, with a quiet clarity that cut through the lingering tension, he said, "And sometimes the people we overlook are the very ones who have already been serving others in ways we never see." And the words landed differently this time, not just as a general truth, but as something specific, something pointed, and the room seemed to recognize it all at once. Hannah's fingers stilled for a moment against her baby's back, her breath catching softly, not from fear, but from the sudden sense that the moment was no longer passing her by, that it was, somehow, turning toward her. Charlotte's shoulders drew back slightly, her composure still intact but no longer effortless, as if she could feel the ground beneath the situation shifting in a way she had not anticipated. Pastor Daniel's gaze settled fully now, no longer moving across the room, but resting with quiet certainty, and when he spoke again, his voice was just as calm, just as steady, but there was no mistaking the direction now. "Hannah Brooks," he said, her name carried clearly through the chapel, not loud, not forceful, but unmistakable, and in that instant, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, because the woman who had been standing quietly on the edge of everything had just been brought to the center of it all. For a moment, Hannah did not move, not because she did not hear her name, but because hearing it spoken aloud in that space felt unfamiliar, almost unreal, like a sound that did not belong to her life, and the quiet weight of it settled over her shoulders in a way she could not immediately shake. The baby shifted gently against her, a soft breath brushing against her collarbone, and that small, steady presence grounded her just enough to lift her gaze, slowly, carefully, as if rising too quickly might break whatever fragile balance had just formed. All around her, heads turned fully now, no longer pretending, no longer avoiding, their attention drawn openly toward the place where she stood, and the same eyes that had once glanced past her now lingered, curious, uncertain, searching for something they had missed. Charlotte remained still, but the change in her was subtle and undeniable, her expression no longer as certain, her posture still composed yet no longer effortless, as if the moment had slipped slightly beyond her control, and though she did not look directly at Hannah at first, there was a flicker of awareness in her gaze, a recognition that something had shifted in a way she had not anticipated. Pastor Daniel did not rush the moment, his patience allowing the room to settle into this new awareness, and when he spoke again, his voice carried that same calm steadiness, but now there was a quiet warmth beneath it, something that softened the edges of the tension without erasing it. "Would you come forward for a moment?" he said, not as a command, but as an invitation, one that held no pressure yet seemed to carry its own quiet certainty. Hannah hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly around the small blanket draped over her baby, her mind moving through the practical questions first: where to step, how to walk, what to say, all the small details that suddenly felt larger than they should have, and for a brief second, the instinct to decline, to remain where she was and let the moment pass, flickered through her, but it faded just as quickly as it came, replaced by something steadier, something quieter, a sense that this moment was not something to avoid. She adjusted the baby carefully, ensuring the child was secure against her shoulder, and then she took a step forward, her sneaker brushing softly against the wooden floor, the sound barely audible yet somehow marking the shift more clearly than anything else. The distance to the front of the chapel was not far, but it felt longer under the weight of so many eyes, each step measured, unhurried, her posture straight not out of confidence but out of simple determination to move forward without shrinking. And as she passed the rows of pews, the space seemed to part slightly, people shifting just enough to allow her through, their movements small but telling, as if the boundaries that had once defined her place were no longer as solid as they had seemed moments ago. Charlotte watched her now, fully, no longer looking away, her gaze following Hannah's quiet progress, and though her expression remained composed, there was something new beneath it, something that did not quite fit the certainty she had carried before, a subtle tension that lingered in the set of her jaw, in the way her fingers no longer rested as easily against the pew. Hannah reached the front at last, stopping a few feet from Pastor Daniel, her breath steady despite everything, her focus anchored in the simple act of standing, of being present. And as she lifted her eyes to meet his, there was no fear there now, only a quiet readiness, as if whatever came next, she would face it not by stepping back, but by remaining exactly where she was. Pastor Daniel met her gaze with a quiet kindness that did not draw attention to itself, yet somehow steadied everything around it, and for a brief moment, the noise of the room seemed to fade, leaving only the soft hum of the air and the faint rustle of clothing as people adjusted in their seats, waiting. Hannah stood there with her baby resting against her shoulder, aware of every eye in the chapel, yet no longer overwhelmed by them, as if the act of stepping forward had shifted something inside her, something that had been waiting for this moment without her even realizing it. Pastor Daniel turned slightly, angling his body so that both Hannah and the congregation were within his view, his posture open, his presence calm, and when he spoke, his voice carried that same steady warmth, but now with a quiet clarity that felt intentional. "There are stories in this room that we do not always hear," he said, pausing just long enough for the words to settle, not because they are not important, but because they are often lived in silence, and a subtle ripple moved through the pews, not discomfort exactly, but recognition, the kind that comes when something true is spoken aloud. Charlotte watched from where she stood, her expression composed but no longer untouched, her attention fixed now in a way it had not been before, as if she were listening not just with her ears, but with something deeper, something that had been quietly stirred. Pastor Daniel glanced toward Hannah again, a brief, acknowledging look, before continuing. "This past winter," he said, his voice softening just slightly, "when the storm damaged part of this building. Many of you know we faced a difficult time, repairs were needed, costs were high, and for a while, we did not know how we would manage," and a few heads nodded, memories of that time resurfacing, the uncertainty, the conversations that had filled this very space weeks ago. "What you may not know," he continued, his tone steady, "is that much of what was restored came from someone who asked for nothing in return, someone who chose not to be seen, not to be thanked publicly, but simply to help." And the room grew quieter still, curiosity now fully replacing the earlier tension, people leaning slightly forward, drawn into the unfolding truth. Hannah felt her breath catch softly, her fingers pausing for just a second against her baby's back, because she knew where this was going, even before the words were fully spoken. And a flicker of uncertainty passed through her, not fear, but something close to hesitation, the instinct to remain unseen, to keep what she had done as something private, something that belonged only to her and the quiet choices she made each day. Pastor Daniel let the silence hold for a moment longer, his gaze steady, his expression unchanged, and then, with the same calm certainty that had guided every word before, he said, "Hannah Brooks has been one of those people," and the words moved through the room like a gentle wave, soft but undeniable, shifting everything they touched. A collective stillness followed, deeper than before, as if the room itself was adjusting to this new understanding, and Charlotte's eyes widened just slightly, the smallest crack in her composure, as her gaze returned fully to Hannah. No longer searching for what did not belong, but trying to reconcile what she had just heard with what she thought she knew. Hannah lowered her eyes again, not out of shame, but out of humility, her hand resuming its gentle rhythm against her baby's back, as if reminding herself that nothing had truly changed about who she was, only what others were beginning to see. And as the light from the stained glass shifted once more across the floor, it no longer felt like it was dividing the room, but quietly bringing it together in a way that no one had expected. The silence that followed did not feel empty, it felt full, heavy with realization, as if every person in the room was quietly rearranging what they thought they understood, and Pastor Daniel did not rush to fill it, allowing the truth to settle in its own time, to reach each person differently, without force. Hannah remained still at the front, her presence unchanged, her posture the same, her hand continuing that gentle, steady motion against her baby's back, as if reminding herself that nothing about her worth had just been created in this moment, it had only been revealed. A faint shift moved through the pews, subtle but unmistakable, people sitting a little straighter, glancing toward her not with curiosity now, but with something softer, something closer to respect, though it came quietly, almost cautiously. As if they were still learning how to see her differently, Charlotte stood where she was, but the space around her no longer felt the same, the certainty that had once defined her presence now replaced with something quieter, more uncertain, and though her expression remained composed, there was a tension in the way she held her shoulders, a stillness that suggested she was no longer entirely sure where she stood in this moment. Pastor Daniel drew a slow breath, his hands still loosely folded. And continued, his voice carrying that same calm clarity. "Hannah never asked to be recognized," he said, his gaze moving gently across the room. "In fact, she asked specifically not to be." And a few people shifted again, the weight of those words settling deeper than before, because it was one thing to help, but another entirely to do so without wanting anything in return. Hannah's eyes lowered slightly, her fingers pausing for just a second before resuming their quiet rhythm, and there was a softness in her expression now, not pride, not embarrassment, just a quiet acceptance of what was being said, as if she understood that this moment was no longer hers to control. "She worked late hours," Pastor Daniel continued, his tone steady, "balancing more than most of us will ever see, and still found a way to give." And as he spoke, the contrast became clearer, not just between people, but between choices, between what was visible and what had remained hidden. Charlotte's gaze shifted again, this time lingering on Hannah longer than before, and there was something different in her eyes now, not the sharp judgment from earlier, but a flicker of something more complex, something unsettled, as if she were seeing a version of reality that did not align with the one she had already decided on. The baby stirred softly, a small sound breaking through the stillness, and Hannah adjusted the blanket gently, her focus instinctively returning to the child, as if grounding herself once more in the simple truth of what mattered most. Even as the room around her continued to shift, Pastor Daniel paused again, allowing the moment to breathe, and then, with a quiet steadiness, he added, "There are many ways to show faith, but perhaps the most powerful ones are the ones no one applauds." And the words lingered, not as a correction, but as a reflection, something for each person to carry in their own way. The light from the stained glass shifted again, casting softer colors now across the floor, across the pews, across the faces that had once turned away and now remained fixed in quiet attention, and in that gentle glow, the distance that had once separated Hannah from the rest of the room no longer felt as wide, no longer as certain. Charlotte exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, her gaze dropping for just a moment before lifting again, and though she did not speak, the silence around her had changed, no longer filled with quiet authority, but with something else entirely, something that did not need words to be understood, as the truth of the moment continued to settle into every corner of the chapel. The chapel remained still, but the stillness had changed, no longer heavy with judgment but filled with something quieter, something reflective, and Pastor Daniel allowed that silence to linger just a moment longer before he spoke again, his voice steady and grounded, carrying a tone that felt less like correction and more like invitation. "It is easy," he said slowly, his eyes moving gently across the congregation, "to recognize generosity when it is visible, when it is announced, when it comes with recognition." And a few subtle shifts followed his words, people adjusting in their seats, not out of discomfort alone, but from the quiet realization that those words were not abstract, they were immediate, present, undeniable. Hannah stood where she was, her posture unchanged, her focus still anchored in the small, steady presence of her baby, whose breathing had softened into a calm rhythm, and for a moment, the contrast between the simplicity of that quiet care and the complexity of everything unfolding around her felt almost overwhelming. Yet she did not move, she did not speak, she simply remained. Charlotte's gaze lowered again, just slightly, as if the weight of the moment had begun to settle more deeply, her fingers now resting still against the pew, no longer tapping or shifting, but holding, as if grounding herself in something she could not yet fully name. Pastor Daniel turned his attention briefly toward Hannah again, a soft acknowledgement in his expression, before continuing, "But the kind of generosity that asks for nothing, that expects nothing, that gives quietly even when no one is watching." He paused, letting the words breathe. "That is the kind that reflects something greater than ourselves," and the room seemed to absorb that in a different way, more personally now, as if each person present could feel the space between what they had assumed and what they were now being shown. A faint sound came from the baby, a small, contented sigh, and Hannah adjusted the blanket once more, her movements gentle and familiar, the kind that did not seek attention yet held a quiet grace of its own, and for the first time a few of the people closest to her smiled softly, not out of politeness, but from something more genuine, something that had shifted within them. Charlotte lifted her eyes again, this time not just looking at Hannah, but truly seeing her, and the difference was subtle but unmistakable. The sharp edges of earlier judgment softened now by something quieter, something that did not erase what had happened, but began to reshape it. Pastor Daniel took another slow breath, his hands still folded, his presence unwavering, and then he added, "We are all given moments to choose how we see one another," his voice calm but firm, "whether we see only what is on the surface, or whether we look deeper, beyond what is easy," and the words settled into the room like a gentle but steady echo, one that did not demand agreement but invited reflection. The light from the stained glass shifted again, casting softer tones now, and in that quiet glow, the space between people seemed less defined, less divided, as if the lines that once separated them had begun to blur. Hannah remained still, her eyes lowered again, not from hesitation, but from humility. As if she understood that this moment was not about elevating her above anyone else, but about revealing something that had always been there, quietly, consistently, without recognition. Charlotte exhaled slowly, her shoulders easing just a fraction, and though she did not speak, the silence around her felt different now, no longer filled with quiet authority, but with something more uncertain, more human, as if the moment had gently taken something from her certainty and replaced it with something she could not yet fully define. While at the front of the chapel, Pastor Daniel stood steady, his gaze calm, as the truth continued to settle into every corner of the room. The quiet did not break all at once, it shifted slowly, like a tide pulling back to reveal something that had always been there beneath the surface, and Pastor Daniel let that silence do its work, his presence steady, his gaze calm, as if he trusted the moment to carry itself forward without force. Hannah stood beside him, her baby resting peacefully now, the small rise and fall of the child's breathing the only movement that felt untouched by the weight of everything else, and though she could feel the attention of the entire room, it no longer pressed against her in the same way. It felt different now, softer, as if the space around her had opened instead of closed. A woman in the second row lowered her eyes, her fingers tightening slightly around the program in her lap, while a man near the aisle shifted uncomfortably, his gaze lingering on Hannah for just a second before dropping, not out of avoidance this time, but reflection, and the room, once divided by quiet judgment, now seemed to share a single, unspoken awareness. Charlotte remained still, but the stillness had changed, no longer composed with certainty, but held together by something more fragile, her posture still upright, her expression controlled, yet her eyes no longer carried the same sharp clarity. Instead they lingered, uncertain, as if searching for footing in a moment that no longer followed the rules she was used to. Pastor Daniel turned slightly, his voice returning with a gentle steadiness. "Grace is not something we perform," he said, his words simple, but carrying a quiet depth. "It is something we live, often in ways no one sees," and the sentence settled into the room not as instruction, but as truth, one that did not demand response, only recognition. Hannah lowered her gaze again, her hand moving instinctively along her baby's back, the same quiet rhythm that had carried her through nights without sleep, through days measured in small victories, and there was no change in her expression, no shift toward pride or self-awareness, only the same quiet presence she had always held. Charlotte inhaled slowly, the breath subtle but visible in the slight rise of her shoulders, and for a moment, her gaze drifted away from Hannah, toward the stained glass windows, toward the light that filtered through them in soft, shifting colors, as if she were searching for something steady in a moment that had gently undone her certainty. Pastor Daniel paused again, then added, "We are all given opportunities to reflect what we believe," his voice calm but clear, "not through what we say, but through how we treat one another," and the words lingered, not directed at any one person, yet impossible to separate from what had just unfolded. A faint murmur passed through the room, not conversation, but acknowledgement, a collective understanding that something had been revealed, not just about Hannah, but about everyone present, and in that shared awareness, the space felt different, less divided, more connected. Though no one had moved from their place, Hannah shifted her weight slightly, adjusting the baby's blanket once more, her movements as natural and unguarded as they had always been, and in that simple gesture, there was a quiet reminder that nothing about her had changed, only what others had chosen to see. Charlotte's gaze returned to her again, slower this time, more deliberate, and though she did not speak, there was something unspoken in her expression now, something that did not erase what had happened, but acknowledged it in a way that words could not fully capture, as if the moment had quietly asked something of her, something she was only beginning to understand. While at the front of the chapel, Pastor Daniel stood steady, allowing the truth of the moment to settle not as a conclusion, but as a beginning. The moment did not demand movement, but something in it invited it, quietly, gently, and for a long second, no one responded, as if the room itself was waiting to see what would happen next, not from the pulpit, but from within the people who had just witnessed something they could not easily forget. Hannah remained where she stood, her presence unchanged, her hand still resting against her baby's back, the slow rhythm of her touch grounding her in something steady, something real, and though the weight of the room had shifted, she did not step forward into it, she did not claim it, she simply existed within it, as she always had. Pastor Daniel's gaze softened slightly, not in conclusion, but in understanding, as if he knew that what needed to be said had already been spoken, and that what remained now was not words, but choices. Small and personal, unfolding quietly within each person present, a faint movement broke through the stillness, subtle at first, as a woman in the front row adjusted herself, then turned slightly, her eyes lingering on Hannah with something that had not been there before, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, she nodded, not a grand gesture, but a simple acknowledgement, one that carried more weight than any applause could have. That small shift seemed to ripple outward, not in noise, but in presence, as others began to look again, not with curiosity, but with recognition, their expressions softening, their posture easing, the distance that once defined the room now giving way to something more connected, more aware. Charlotte stood very still, but the stillness no longer carried authority, it carried thought. Her gaze lowered for a moment before lifting again, this time not scanning, not measuring, but simply meeting the reality in front of her, and for the first time, there was no attempt to control it, no effort to reshape it into something familiar. She took a slow breath, the movement subtle but visible, and then, almost without realizing it, she stepped forward, just one step, small, measured, yet enough to shift her position within the space, enough to place her closer to Hannah, closer to the truth she had just witnessed. The room did not react loudly, there was no sudden sound, no interruption, but the significance of that movement settled quietly, as if everyone present understood that something more than distance was being crossed. Hannah noticed it, of course she did, but she did not react, not outwardly. Her focus still grounded in the child she held, her posture unchanged, as if she did not need acknowledgement to validate what she had already lived through. Charlotte's eyes rested on her for a moment longer, and though her expression remained composed, there was a softness there now, something that had replaced the sharp certainty from before, something quieter, more human, as if the moment had gently reshaped her in a way that words could not fully explain. Pastor Daniel remained at the front, his presence steady, his silence intentional, allowing this quiet unfolding to continue without interruption, and as the light from the stained glass shifted once more, casting gentle colors across the floor and the people standing within it, the room no longer felt divided into separate worlds, but joined in a shared awareness. One that did not erase what had happened, but transformed it into something deeper, something that would remain long after the moment itself had passed. The room did not return to what it had been before, it could not, because something quiet and irreversible had already taken place, not in the arrangement of the pews or the order of the service, but in the way people now saw one another, and that kind of change did not need to be announced to be real. Hannah shifted her weight gently, her baby still resting against her shoulder, and for the first time since she had walked into the chapel, there was no sense of needing to make herself smaller. No quiet calculation of where she should stand or how she should be perceived, there was only presence, simple and unguarded, the kind that comes when dignity is no longer something you protect, but something you carry. Pastor Daniel gave a small nod, not as recognition of status, but as acknowledgement of truth, and then he stepped back slightly, allowing the moment to settle into its natural conclusion, because nothing more needed to be said, everything that mattered had already been revealed. Charlotte stood a few steps away now, closer than she had been before, yet the distance between them felt entirely different, no longer defined by judgment or separation, but by something quieter, something more honest, and after a long second, she took another small step forward, her movements slower now, more deliberate, as if each one required a choice she was only just beginning to understand. She stopped just short of Hannah, her gaze steady but softened, and though the room remained silent, there was no tension in it anymore, only a quiet awareness, and when she finally spoke, her voice was lower than before, stripped of its earlier sharpness. "I was wrong," she said. The words simple, without decoration, yet carrying a weight that made them unmistakably real, and for a moment, that was all she offered, no explanation, no defense, just truth. Hannah looked at her, really looked this time, and there was no triumph in her expression, no sense of victory, only a calm steadiness, as if she had never needed this moment to define her, and she gave the smallest nod, not as acceptance or rejection, but as acknowledgement, because some things did not need to be expanded, they only needed to be understood. The baby stirred softly between them, a gentle reminder of something simpler than everything that had just unfolded, and Hannah adjusted the blanket again, her movements as natural as ever, as if returning quietly to the life she knew, the one built not on recognition, but on small, consistent acts of care. Around them, the congregation remained still, but the stillness now felt shared, not divided, and a few people began to rise slowly, not out of formality, but from something more instinctive, a quiet respect that had nothing to do with titles or appearances, and everything to do with what had just been revealed. The light from the stained glass windows shifted once more, casting a softer glow across the room, and in that gentle light, the differences that had once seemed so sharp felt less important, less defining, as if they had been placed into a wider perspective, one that held more room for grace than judgment. Hannah turned slightly, preparing to return to her seat, not hurried, not hesitant, just moving forward in the same quiet way she always had, and as she did, the path before her felt different now, not because it had changed, but because the way others saw it had. Pastor Daniel watched for a moment, his expression calm, then turned back toward the congregation, ready to continue, knowing that what had just happened would linger far beyond this hour, and somewhere in that stillness, something settled into place, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that did not need to be repeated to be remembered, the understanding that dignity does not ask for permission, and kindness does not wait to be seen. It simply exists, steady and unshaken, even when the world looks the other way. And if this moment moved something in you, if you have ever felt unseen or quietly judged, or if you have ever witnessed kindness that asked for nothing in return, you are not alone. Share what stayed with you. Because sometimes the stories we carry in silence are the ones that remind someone else they are still seen, and if you believe moments like this matter, stay with us, because there are more stories that remember what it means to be human.